Welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are going to talk about Rishi Sunak's taxes and how the rich live. Okay, so I wanted to do a video on a story that came out a couple of months ago about Rishi Sunak's tax return, because I think that the way it was reported in the media was totally didn't tell us the true story, focused completely on the wrong thing. And I think we can learn a lot about how the rich live, what rich people's lives are like, and what real wealth is like by looking at this story. So this story, some of you might have seen it. It came out in the beginning of February, and it was about Rishi Sunak releasing his tax return. And all of the newspaper reports focused exactly on the numbers and the percentage rate of tax that Rishi Sunak paid. So I've got the story here. I'm looking at the BBC version of the story. And this says here, Rishi Sunak paid UK tax of £508,308 on an income of just over 2.2 million, which means he paid a tax rate of something like 23% or something like that. And the story, basically everyone ran the same version of the story, which was Rishi Sunak is paying 23% tax and ordinary high earners are paying 40 or maybe 50% tax once you include national insurance. And as soon as I saw this story, the thing that jumped out at me was not Rishi Sunak's rate of tax that he paid. That is not unusual. In fact, most very wealthy people pay a lot lower rates of tax than that. The thing that jumped out of me was one number was obviously immediately wrong in this story, and nobody mentioned it. So I've spoken a lot about Rishi Sunak's net worth on this channel. Sunday Times Rich List had Rishi Sunak's net worth at something like 730 million. The most recent one, I think, said it came down to 555, 560 million, something like that. Now, imagine, let's take a conservative estimate that the real number is 500 million. In reality, it's probably higher because rich people often hide their wealth. But let's take a conservative estimate, 500 million. Imagine you're Rishi Sunak, 500 million pounds. What is going to be your net passive income? Your passive income you're getting of 500 million pounds. Well, at the moment, Bank of England base rate is about 5%. You can get 5% interest rates on a savings account. So if Rishi Sunak was to take his 500 million and put it into a savings account, he would be making 25 million pounds a year passive income. He's not including his payment he gets for being Prime Minister or anything like that. 25 million pounds a year passive income. How can it be that a man who makes 25 million pounds a year passive income only makes 2 million pounds a year? It doesn't make any sense to me. And as soon as I saw that number, as soon as I saw that article, I really wasn't interested in the tax rate he paid. I was interested in how can it be that his reported income is so much less than what his real income is. So I can basically tell you now the reason why his reported income is so low. Number one is because very wealthy people like Rishi Sunak, most of their wealth is in assets. And in many cases, most of their income from wealth comes in the form of capital gains, which is the price of their assets going up. And capital gains only get taxed when you sell the asset. If you don't sell the asset, then this is what's called unrealized capital gains. It doesn't get taxed in our system, so there's no tax payable. And basically, if you hold a load of assets and the prices go up and up and up, as long as you don't sell anything, then you don't have to put anything on your tax return at all. So, Rishi Sunak, the only reason that his income was even £2 million is because he happened to sell a lot of stock in a US investment fund they had, which netted him a £1.8 million capital gain. If he didn't sell that, then his income would only have been, it says it here, £400,000. So the first thing is, rich people can very, very effectively hide their income by owning assets that the price goes up and they don't sell the assets. Even if we were to accept that Rishi Sunak's income is £2 million, he will never have to sell any assets. If you make £2 million a year, you don't have to sell anything, which means you don't have to declare anything, which means you don't have to pay tax on anything. But the real reason, the main reason why Rishi Sunak is able to declare such a low income is because most of Rishi Sunak's family wealth is owned by Rishi Sunak's wife. And Rishi Sunak's wife, who has had many articles written about her, in many cases doesn't pay any tax because she was a non-dom, a lot of her income is overseas, she doesn't have to pay tax on it here. So, okay, let's explain the situation more clearly, okay? So Rishi Sunak is, on his own, a relatively wealthy man. It's difficult to know exactly how wealthy he is. Rishi Sunak's wife is enormously, unbelievably wealthy. She's worth £500 million, maybe £1 billion. Rishi Sunak's wife's father-in-law is one of the richest men in the world. He's worth £3 to £4 billion, something like this. So Rishi Sunak is declaring £2 million income. Rishi Sunak's wife, we know, is making something like 30 or 40 million pounds passive income a year. Rishi Sunak's wife's father, he's worth, let's say £3 billion. If he's making 5%, now these are conservative estimates, right? Normally, very wealthy people make much more than 5%. If he makes 5% on £3 billion, he'll be making £150 million a year. So what you have here is a man, Rishi Sunak, saying that he makes £2 million a year when his wife makes £1 million a week and his wife's father makes £3 or £4 million a week. So what you have here is a really good example of how rich people live, essentially, which is the money is held in the family. They're making enormous amounts of passive income. Their work income is basically irrelevant, but they only pay tax on their work income and they only show you their work income. And I think it's a fascinating example, really, of how effectively the rich are able to hide their income. So imagine you're Rishi Sunak. Some people will say, listen, that's not his money, it's his wife's money. Imagine you're Rishi Sunak and you're getting paid something like £200,000-300,000 a year to be Prime Minister. Your wife makes £1 million a week. Your father-in-law makes £3 or £4 million a week. What are your financial interests? You know, you get paid a couple £100,000 a year to be Prime Minister and your wife makes £1 million a week. Her dad makes £4 million a week. What are your financial interests? Are your financial interests to take care of the country, or are your financial interests to do what your wife and your father-in-law say? Yeah, you know, I've never met Rishi Sunak. He could be a perfectly nice guy. He could be someone who doesn't care about money. He could be someone who doesn't care about his financial interests. But people who don't care about their financial interests don't normally work for Goldman Sachs, then go do a business degree at Stanford, and then marry the daughter of one of the richest men in the world. So I think what you see here is how the rich live. They own everything, but they basically hide it in their taxes. They hide it in their tax returns. I think probably the most interesting thing about this article is how the media completely bought it. When I saw this, the only interesting thing in this article is that Rishi Sunak's income is wrong. £2.2 million, which is Rishi Sunak's declared income, is nothing for Rishi Sunak's family. It's meaningless for Rishi Sunak's family. They make twice that every single week in passive income. It's totally meaningless. And I think this makes me think of the first time Rishi Sunak came to prominence. I was very interested because I'm a student of history. I'm very interested in medieval history, and I'm also obviously very interested in economics and politics. And anyone who's interested in economics and politics will know political parties are funded in many cases by rich people. They have very rich funders, which means that when they make their decisions, when they make their policies, they have to be very careful not to upset rich people because they get a lot of their money from rich people. They have to be very careful not to upset the newspapers, which in many cases are owned by extremely rich people, because if they upset the newspapers, then the newspapers can turn the public against them and they'll lose elections. So what this means is, for a long period of time, wealthy people have influenced political parties from behind closed doors. And this is a very useful position for a rich person to be in, because you can basically dictate the policies. You can keep your own taxes low, for example, and you don't have to give up your anonymity. So these guys can live lives of luxury. They can kind of control the political system, and you don't even have to know who they are. So it's a great situation for them to be in. When Rishi Sunak came out and became Chancellor and latterly became Prime Minister, it was interesting for me, because why would you want to be the Prime Minister, take a load of shit, lose a load of your privacy, when the rich were already controlling policy anyway? Not only is it a load of work and a load of hassle that Rishi Sunak doesn't need, it makes it increasingly obvious to the general public what was previously kind of hidden, which is that rich people control policy. And this kind of reminds me of a thing that happened in history back in the sort of 1200s, 1300s, when a lot of when banking was invented in Europe, especially in Italy, a lot of very wealthy families were created because they started to make a ton of money from banking. We have families like the Medicis in Florence, we have the banking families of Genoa and Venice, these very wealthy banking families. They made a huge amount of money and they became as rich as kings. And at that time, kings sort of ruled everything, but they weren't really respected because they weren't from aristocratic families. So what did they do? They started to think, how can we use our money to buy prestige, to buy respect, and to buy power? And they started to do things like, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give my banking empire to my first son, and I'm going to use my second son and my third son and my daughters to try and marry into power, basically. You know, I'm going to try and marry my daughter to the King of France and try and get her powerful. I'm going to try to get my son to be Pope, this kind of thing. We're going to try to use our family to build connections. And really, when Rishi Sunak came in, what I saw was an extremely wealthy man thinking, when I'm going to give my empire to my son, maybe I can use my daughter to effectively become Prime Minister of England. And if you consider Rishi Sunak, who's making 200 grand a year from being Prime Minister, and is making £3 million a week from being part of one of the richest families in the world, what are his financial interests and who is he really working for? I think this is the big question that needs to be asked here. But I think the most interesting thing here is basically, number one, the wealthy are hiding their wealth. Rishi Sunak is hiding their wealth. They're not paying enough taxes. But number two, they are trying to rebrand themselves as a kind of aspirational kind of normal. Because, so Rishi Sunak, all of his wealth is tied up in stocks and shares, and he can basically release as much income as he wants by selling assets year by year. He's chosen this year to release £2.2 million of income, when we know that could have been 300 grand, it could have been 50 million if you wanted. He's chosen to say my income is 2.2 million. And I think that is actually a tactical choice from Rishi Sunak, because when he says I make 2.2 million, what he says is I make the kind of money that a very successful banker makes, that a very successful businessman makes, that an ordinary family aspires for their kids to make one day. And what he is doing there is he is saying, I, Rishi Sunak, who is part of one of the richest families in the world that makes millions of pounds every week in passive income, am just like what you aspire for your kids to be. And I think he's trying to basically draw a connection between the financial situation of the super rich, Rishi Sunak's family is definitely part of the super rich, and what ordinary people aspire to be. And in reality, very, very few people will ever make £2 million, but it is the kind of money that an ordinary family can aspire to make. You know, there are ordinary families who have seen the value of their housing go up to something like £2 million, especially if you live in a big city like London. You know, I made £2 million in 1 year, despite coming from a very poor background. So this kind of money is aspirational. The kind of money that Rishi Sunak's family owns is totally impossible to achieve. And what Rishi Sunak is trying to do here is rebrand the wealth of the super rich as the aspirational wealth of the middle class. And he's trying to build a connection between the super rich and an aspirational middle class family. And the reason he's trying to do that is so that when people like me say, look, the problem is the rich, you need to tax the rich. Ordinary people like you, who are not super rich, but aspire to own property, aspire to financial security, think I'm going to tax you because you think that your financial situation is similar to Rishi Sunak's, but it's not. So, to conclude, Rishi Sunak doesn't pay 25% taxes. He pays virtually 0% taxes because Rishi Sunak's family income is not £2 million a year. It's hundreds of millions of pounds a year because they are billionaires. They want you to think they're normal so that when I say tax the rich, you hear tax you. These guys get richer and richer every year. They use their hundreds of millions of pounds of passive income to compete with you, to compete with your kids, for your assets, for your homes, for the things that you need. They get richer every year, you get poorer every year. If you don't tax them, you are refusing to defend yourself from the people who are coming from your homes. You have to tax the rich. You have to tax people like Rishi Sunak. If you don't tax them, your kids will be poor. That's why I do what I do every week. Tell your friends, tell your mum, tax the rich or your kids will be poor. It's inequality. You've got to fix it. Thank you.